Well, hey everyone, and thank you so much for coming out to the Babcock today to enjoy Freakin' Friedkin. This is our series looking at director William Friedkin, who passed last year. We did The Exorcist back in November, of course, but we're going to take a look at four other films of his this February. And along with that, we have a discussion with my good friend Lincoln Sevier. I went to film school with Lincoln, and he is also from Billings, so a great guy, and he's also a freaking freak. So we're glad to have him here. Everyone, Lincoln Sevier.
Hey everybody, I am a Friedkin freak. I recently became a Friedkin freak. Brian back in September reached out to me and said he was going to do this festival, and he said, "Would you like to be the expert?" And I said, "I will get there." So I have spent the last 3 months watching almost all of Friedkin's films, and it's a fascinating journey. And I've become very interested in him as a director. So I'm excited to talk about The French Connection today.
In your journey, what have you learned? Because you've probably seen a few freaking films before I reached out to you, but what have you learned about him as a filmmaker?
Yeah. There's some filmmakers, the word genius gets bandied about a lot in artistic worlds. And I've always taken that to assume kind of this inherent talent, like Spielberg just had filmmaking it just inherently in his bones from day one. If that's the definition of a genius, Friedkin is not a genius. What you witness on his journey is someone figuring out the craft and doing things that just don't work at all and trying something completely different. And the one thing that he was always very good at is swinging for the fences, trying something really bold. So his failures really flop and his successes are really interesting because of the bold things that he's trying in them. So this is his The French Connection is his fifth film, and it's really his first film of any magnitude.
This was a Best Picture winner for 1971, and other awards, I'm sure, that were along with that. Did he win director that year?
Yeah, no, it won the best actor for Gene Hackman, best director for William Friedkin, and it won the best screenplay. But part of what swept everybody up with this movie, because when I first saw this movie, I didn't understand why it would win all of these awards. And it helps to put it in the context of when it came out. What I love about the 70s is that the great directors of the 40s, 50s, and 60s were spending those decades dialing in how to make great films and how to make great genre films. So Robert Wise, who did West Side Story and The Sound of Music, he was perfecting all of the elements of the musical. And David Lean, who did The Bridge over Quai and Dr. Zhivago, and he did Lawrence of Arabia, he was perfecting the historical epic to the point where other historical epics were doing their best David Lean impression. And so as films were getting cleaner and more refined and better, audiences started to get a little bored. Like they knew exactly what to expect from a Western. They knew exactly what to expect from a musical. And the thrill of going to the movies was kind of getting lost in the early to mid 60s. And what happened, why Bonnie and Clyde was so revolutionary, is Arthur Penn said, okay, we've all seen the sweeping romance of a couple on the run from the law, but then he incorporated uncomfortable themes, the death of innocent civilians. He incorporated uncomfortable violence. That everybody started to get an appetite for subverting genres and doing something unexpected. Now, Friedkin was entirely in that camp. And one of the main ways he does that in this film is with the hero, Popeye Doyle. By this point, we're all used to anti-heroes, but you still kind of like them. Bonnie and Clyde, they were anti-heroes, but they were really freaking charming.
Yeah.
Popeye Doyle is not charming, and he's a bit of a racist. And you're not entirely sure, you believe he's a good cop, but you're not entirely sure that his judgment isn't clouded. So as you go into this film, look for ways in which Friedkin is trying to take your expectations of this type of movie and doing something a little bit different. The other thing before we go into the film is Friedkin had this ambition to make the film feel like it was happening in real time. And the way he wanted to achieve that was with documentary film techniques. Because he found when you're watching a documentary and there's kind of the chaos of a real moment happening, you have this feeling that anything can happen. So for his cameraman, he got a gentleman who was from Cuba who had basically been documenting Fidel Castro's revolution. And when he moved to New York, he was the guy to go to for low budget or for scrappy filmmaking. And so the decision that William Friedkin made in this film is he would not include the cameraman on rehearsals. So he'd bring in the actors and bring in the lights and get everything set up and figure out where the blocking is and all of that. And once they're all ready to go, he'd bring in the cameraman. So the cameraman was not aware of what was going to be taking place. And Friedkin's theory was the guy who's never seen the blocking is going to get more, it's a reaction versus a plan, you know? And so that's laced throughout all of this film. So I hope you guys enjoy this. I have a lot to say about it, but I'd rather say it after everybody sees the film, you know?
Absolutely. This is just a little taste of things to look for, but we will have a longer discussion after the film. Thank you so much for being here, and please enjoy The French Connection. All right, everyone, we are back. We just watched French Connection. I hope you really enjoyed that. I'm back with Lincoln Sevier to talk a little bit about what you just saw, some of the questions that you might need answered, and just a little more insight onto how William Friedkin created this. So, Lincoln, what was your first takeaway when the credits started rolling? What was the first feeling you had watching French Connection?
Um, just how flawed that character was. Like he was a man who was obsessed, and the whole film is this driving obsession that's not necessarily in the best interest of the people around him. Like it ends with him killing the wrong guy,
Yep.
and Roy Scheider, that's all sinking into his partner, and all he's like is I have him, and he runs after him. And an interesting tidbit that I learned reading about the film, the way that the original plan was the end beat of the movie was he kills the dude, he runs out of the frame, and the film's over. And in the edit bay, as they're sitting on that last shot, he had the thought, what if a gun went off? That was a decision that he makes in the edit bay. So when you hear that shot at the end, obviously it's not, we're not supposed to know exactly what happened, but I was fascinated to know that that wasn't in the script. Friedkin was breaking a lot of rules with not getting permits. You know, often when you're outside in the streets, you know, you have bystanders that are not part of the thing, and that also really gives it a sense of a living, breathing film. One of the most iconic moments of this film, of course, is that chase sequence. And there's a couple chases. There's another one in To Live and Die in LA that we're going to talk about when that film comes out. But what I love about this chase sequence is he's working with the producer of Bullitt. And Bullitt has a very famous chase. That was done 3 years earlier, I think, in 1968. And he's trying to figure out, how do I do something different? And they get the idea of the villain getting on a subway car and our guy missing the subway car and running up to the street and taking over a vehicle and then chasing him. But the problem is, how do you visually show the geography of a subway car and a vehicle on the ground? So then they had the idea of, well, let's find an L train. But the L train allowed for this high stakes chase that's incredibly lopsided in the stakes, because this thing's just moving along the tracks the way it can move. Now he manages to take out the driver and get it to not stop and whatever, but all of the intensity of the chase is happening by our obsessed driver. And what I love about that is when two cars are barreling down the street, the one in the front is kind of putting everybody in harm's way, and the one behind is just following in their wake. It's Gene Hackman that's just barreling through streets and crazy speeds. You know, you see just the danger that he's causing everybody around him as he's trying to catch up with this train. And one of the details that I thought, the documentary details, is when he runs down from the L train and he's trying to flag a car, and the first car he misses, and the second car he misses, and finally the third car he stops. Those first two cars were not part of the choreography. So they liked the idea of, Gene, we're going to have you run out in traffic and have two cars that you kind of wave at, and then our hero car is going to come over here and you'll take him out. So the hero car was the only one that was kind of knowingly part of that scene. And they film all these scenes. They have the moment with the lady with the shopping cart, and you know, they have these close call moments that they choreograph. But as Friedkin was cutting these all together, it just didn't feel intense. Like you choreograph these little moments, but it just didn't have you on the edge of your seat the way that he wanted. And he criticized the stunt driver, and the stunt driver said, if you want to get intense shots, it's going to be dangerous, and you're going to be in the car with me. And so Friedkin gets into the car, and the stunt driver gets in, and they mount several cameras, and Friedkin's holding a camera, and the guy, without any permits, drives like a freaking madman, 80 miles an hour, weaving through these streets, cutting around traffic. Anytime you see that forward facing camera, that was the most dangerous shot of William Friedkin's career, because there wasn't permission and there wasn't a plan for it. And it is terrifying through that perspective. Then they cut to Gene Hackman and he's doing his thing and whatever. But those shots facing forward were real and they were dangerous. And he never did anything like that again. And even though the chase scene in To Live and Die in L.A. is amazing, and some might say even greater than this one, it was all planned, because after he was done with that, like, he retired that recklessness from his career. He doesn't look back on that fondly. He sees himself as very lucky that he didn't ruin his career by making reckless decisions in this film. You know, what was your impression of the detective aspect of this film?
The very first time we see him, Gene Hackman's dressed in this Santa suit, and Roy Scheider is playing like a hot dog vendor, and they have this great communication that Gene Hackman's looking in the window at this guy, and then he has kids in front of him, and he's like, "All right, let's sing some songs," and he starts ringing this bell. And then immediately Roy Scheider just starts putting his hot dog thing away and goes
Right.
in and busts them. And it's like the real life people probably had that sort of
Yeah.
relationship.
And he respected us as an audience for not, like, I don't believe he like cuts to a close up of the bell ringing and cuts to Roy being like, oh, he's trusting that us as an audience are going to understand this was the signal. I
Yep.
love when a director will treat you
Yeah.
with respect.
The very beginning of this movie that kind of plays out like this short silent film, in that it's in France and we just see someone watching these guys, and then someone comes up and shoots him. We understand that without any dialogue really being said. We understand that, the stakes of watching this guy, it's a dangerous thing just to even have eyes on him. And the way that Gene Hackman is, like you said, the obsession that he has of going after this guy, that when he sees him at that nightclub, he really isn't doing anything that suspicious, but he just knows that there is something with this guy.
Something wrong with that table. There's something funny about that table. I don't
Yeah.
remember exactly what he says.
The table is definitely wrong.
Yeah, and he just
Yeah.
and that kicks off this whole obsession.
This is a real story that happened about 10 years before. And the reason he didn't make it a period piece from 1961 is because he didn't have the budget to change the cars and change the hairstyles. So he set it in modern times. But the two cops that were involved in this drug bust 10 years before were advisors on the film. So he was able to follow them around and pick their brain and learn about their techniques. One of the techniques that they would use is when two of them are interrogating a witness, one of them would be asking relevant questions and the other one would just be saying some out of nowhere stuff to throw the person off kilter. So when they're doing the interrogation at the beginning of the film, and he keeps saying, like,
Have you ever been to Poughkeepsie?
Hey, man, come on, give me a break.
Hey,
Man, I don't know
come
what
on,
you're talking about,
say it.
man.
Let me hear you say it. Come on.
and then Roy Scheider's coming in with actual real questions. I thought that was so bizarre, and the questions just felt so racist. It helped a little bit to know that was a technique. You know what I mean? That was actually like a thing that these real cops would do. I don't think it translates that way. I think it just translates as him being a racist prick.
All right, Popeye's here. Get your hands on your heads. Get off the bar and get on the wall.
So that was a bold, subversive decision that he tried that I think at the time everybody was really into. They're really excited by it. I think some audiences now don't know how to feel about it, because even our anti-heroes aren't racist. They're still good at heart. They don't want to hurt any innocent people. But that was one of those bold swing for the fences things that Friedkin did. Is he said, like, let's make him genuinely unlikable, and let's make the villain, the Charnier, the Frenchman, let's make him charming. Let's make him a gentleman. A little story about our villain, Fernando Rey. Friedkin was a big fan of the film Z. It was really big at the time, and it was a documentary style, and it was a really electric film. And he said, I want that guy. I want the guy in that movie. It's Fernando Rey. They talk to the agent and they say, we want Fernando Rey, and they make a deal and they get him to come, and Fernando Rey flies out, and William Friedkin meets him at the airport, and he arrives and William Friedkin sees him and panics. and makes a phone call and says, "This isn't the guy. This isn't the guy that I want." So Fernando Rey wasn't Enzi, uh, and he wasn't even French. He's Spanish. But by this point, the deal was made, and he ended up being such an amazing villain. But Friedkin says, I won't take credit for the casting of that role because that was actually a mistake on my part. One of the things, the car chase was entirely fictional, the car subway chase, but the scene of going out and in where Charnier is trying to not be on the same train as Popeye Doyle was a part of this story. Maybe that's a slightly more elaborate version of it, but Friedkin had the ability to hear those types of stories and say, "Oh my God, cinematically that would be a really neat scene," And
Yeah.
that was such an intense moment for something so relatively simple. And the interesting play of them both at first trying to act like they're not doing what they're doing. The
Hmm.
whole time Gene Hackman's trying to act casual. And one of the great affronts at the end of that scene is when the guy waves to him.
Yeah.
Because that was him tipping his hand, being like, "I know that just happened, and you know that just happened. We
Yeah.
both know that just happened."
And then the
Yeah.
callback of when they have the bridge locked off and he does the wave to him again.
Oh, yes.
Uh,
That's great.
we all know that in the 70s, New York is not the New York that it is today. We know that it was a little grungier, a little seedier. We've seen that in the films of Martin Scorsese. We've kind of seen New York evolve over the last 50 years. But this is probably the dirtiest I've ever seen New York before. And it really also kind of juxtaposes those scenes in France are beautiful. And then we get to New York and everything's a little dirtier, much like our antagonists and protagonists. At the very end, that building is decaying. And it does hint a little bit into things we'll see later with Friedkin in these sort of themes of people that are stuck in these hellish situations.
Friedkin's peak was very brief. In 71, he made The French Connection. 73, he made The Exorcist. And then his magnum opus is going to be The Sorcerer. And his magnum opus goes terribly wrong.
Hmm.
Today, we think of it as a masterpiece. In 77, we didn't think
Yeah.
of it at all. And we can get more into that when that comes out. But ever since that point, he was just on his way down, getting smaller budgets and smaller budgets, and he has a couple lucky breaks. To Live and Die in LA was a really lucky break where he got a decent story and a decent budget. But for the most part, he went on to make 20 additional films that just became kind of more and more stuck in the weeds of small and independent and unacclaimed films. The films we picked out for this Friedkin Festival are what we feel are great, really worthy of your time films. I find a lot of his other films fascinating, but I don't necessarily want to take up everybody's time with them.
So, to close this out, next week we have Sorcerer from 1977. Roy Scheider is back, fresh off of Jaws. What little nugget do you want to leave people to think about for the next week in anticipation for Sorcerer?
Yeah, boy, if there's only one of these movies you can go see, go check out The Sorcerer. Skip what you just watched. No, the Sorcerer is the hidden gem. When you say, "I like The French Connection," everybody's like, "Yeah, sure you do. It's an Academy Award-winning picture, whatever." The Sorcerer is freaking amazing, and it was overlooked when it came out. It came out the same month as Star Wars, and suddenly Star Wars had everybody excited about the future and positivity, and he was still in the brooding, like, "Oh, it's a tough world we live in," and nobody had the appetite for it. So at the Chinese theater, the big theater in LA, Star Wars is big, everybody's watching it, goes away for 1 week, Sorcerer replaces it. After a week, Chinese theater's like, let's just put Star Wars back. And so it was his grandest gesture. And it was a tragic flop that took 20 or 30 years for people to rediscover and say, "Oh my God, that might be his best film." So check out The Sorcerer. You're
Yeah.
going to love it.
And spoiler alert for anyone that has not looked into this film at all, there are no wizards, there's no monsters, there's nothing like that. Sorcerer
Nothing
is
magic.
is a bit of a misleading title, but still, again, one of
Yeah.
his best films. Well, thanks again to Lincoln Sevier for introing this and sticking around and having a discussion with us. We'll be back next week with a discussion on Sorcerer. See you then.